Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Avorion episode 46. I'm Enigmius and today we're continuing with the Serpovectem build. We're basically picking up where we left off in the last episode. I had mentioned that this section of the ship may or may not still be here when we got to this episode, and as you can see it's still here. I tried a few different things in other spots on the ship, specifically the underside. And I determined that this particular section that we're looking at right now is in line with sort of the other things that I had in mind and what I ultimately decided to do for the underside of the ship. So now it's just a matter of filling it out. And if it looks a little bit familiar what we're doing here, it's because it's very close to what we did for the side pieces. Except now it's just 90 degrees, turned 90 degrees and filled out on top. So very straightforward in terms of what we're doing. We're just kind of giving it a little bit of a wider edge, outer edge, with a bit of a soft curve to it, as soft as we can get on something this narrow. And then we'll fill in underneath a little more narrow. It's actually going to be a little bit wider, the underneath section, the main structural element, than it is on the sides of the ship, because I decided that we could put some things in the fin, I guess, that's sticking up. We could put some equipment in there, if for no other reason than for giggles, I guess. And because it's not, going to be directly comparable to the side pieces in terms of your ability to look at it and see that there's a difference, a little bit wider, I think, is not going to be that much of a big deal. But what I did encounter was a bit of trouble getting this front section to line up the way that I would like it to, as it's sort of curving down. I used a few shapes just to get a more refined sort of curve, more angles in play when we're talking about putting together curves out of small lines. I decided to use some shapes that would support that, but made it more difficult to then extend sloped sections off of it so that it curves off to the sides. More of the compound curve, creating complexity and challenge scenario that we talk about so frequently. In fact, you can see we've got a couple pieces that I deleted, and we're kind of spinning around and we're looking at things, but we're not really actually placing a whole lot of anything, because this is where I started to realize that it was going to be kind of tricky. You can see I'm trying to figure out where I can place blocks that will intersect cleanly with the main lines that are defining this shape, and do it in such a way so that everything joins up the way that it's supposed to. There are no exposed seams. The line is convincing. We don't have... The worst thing that I could do on a shape like this is have the slope changing direction a little bit somewhere, because it immediately stands out and it makes it pretty much impossible to sell it as a curve. If I'm going to do something like a curve that's kind of working one way and then it changes direction and works another way, it has to be done a certain way so that it flows. It can't just be this little blob in the middle that doesn't line up with everything else around it, because if it is, it looks like it's wrong. It doesn't look like it's something that was done deliberately to good effect. So after a certain amount of time was spent sort of messing around with it, cleaning it up, changing it, trying something else, you're only seeing a small portion of the time that I spent actually working on it, trying to get it lined up the way that I wanted it. We will get it done before the end of the episode, I can promise you that, but for right now, it's a little bit tricky. So I had originally set up something on the underside of the ship where we're about to start working now. Similar concept, where instead of having one sort of wing-like structure sticking straight down from the underside of the ship, I would have two extending outward on an angle. And I had the angle was a bit more acute, so the things on the ends didn't hang as low as they will with this particular layout. But it was a little bit too much. The angle was a little bit too much to work with and to try and build off of it and do anything more than extremely simple shapes. So I removed those, and then I started with what you see here, which is basically it's mirrored. So whatever we're doing directly in front of us, you can see is also happening on the other side. They're extending out at a 45-degree angle. Very simple and straightforward. And what this does is it makes building everything so that it resembles the other elements of the ship that much easier, just by keeping it at a very simple, straightforward kind of angle. And you can see that this curve on this main structural element is a little bit more plain. It's a little bit more uniform than it is on the ones that are sticking out the side or even the top. And that's because, again, the nature of the beast, we've basically added in an extra angle to consider in terms of the way everything is going to line up. So to keep it a little bit more on the simple side, I decided to do a curve as it extends downward from the ship. You can still see that it's got sort of, it's curving outward on the front and the back, but it's not as complex. And again, just for that reason, is because we've got the extra angle, and I wanted to make sure that we weren't giving ourselves too much of a headache for the sake of something that really isn't that large or important, that it justified the headache. It's just a simple decision that I made. And in this case, I don't regret it, because it does end up being, I think, in line with other things that are happening elsewhere on the ship. It puts a little bit of structural detail. It fills things out in a part of the ship that I felt really sort of needed it. It needed something here beyond just little trivial details that we can add later on. It had to be something that was noticeable, but without necessarily needing to draw attention to itself. So that's where we came up with this whole idea. Roughed it in with cube or rectangle blocks, and then follow up with the various different slope blocks that we need in order to make it work. One of the things that I think about it now, and I don't even realize, or I don't even know why I did it. Unlike the sort of wings out the side and that fin sticking up on the top, where this wide sort of flat structural element is flat, I actually made this so that it kind of thins out as it moves towards the outer edges. You can see we're putting in these sloped blocks now and that support that. And for some reason, I literally just realized this now as I was kind of looking at it and trying to describe what I was doing. And I like it. It's an odd place to be adding details, specifically when we've just been talking about trying to keep things a little bit simple, because it could be such a pain in the ass if we overdo it. But we tapered them off on the front and the back of this thing. Okay, so that's what I did. It's news to me too. Right now, what I'm working on is trying to smooth off these edges. They're blocky, they're coarse, they're unrefined, and so part of the process, as always, is to go around. Obviously, we smoothed off the sides, the front, or the main structural elements, but these leading and trailing edges are a little bit too rough for me, and so it's a question of how we can fill these in to reduce that coarseness as much as we can. And again, we're back to that mystery shape, that shape that we looked at that isn't available in the game and is only necessary in certain specific circumstances, and this happens to be one of those circumstances. So for the block that we don't really need, we tend to find, for whatever reason, with the way that I build, it ends up being a block that we can use on a fairly regular basis. Who knew? But you get the idea. We're kind of doing what we can with what we've got in order to take the roughest edges off, so that when you look at it, it's not the first thing you see. You don't see the little jaggy bits necessarily as clearly as you would if we had just sort of left them and not put any effort into smoothing things off. So we've got these main structural elements now extending down from the ship at a 45-degree angle, and I wanted to build an edge into these as well, in very much the same way as we did with the side and the top section, just kind of flaring it out a little bit along the edge, and then also having a bit of a curve, a bit of a soft curve to it, so that it's, again, a little bit more refined looking, a little bit less sort of low effort looking, I guess would be one way of describing it. At this point with my builds, if you've been following my builds for a while, you know that if I left it looking blocky, it's because I wasn't willing to put the effort in, and not because necessarily I felt it was the best approach. I don't tend to do blocky. Even when I say, you know what, I'm okay with it being blocky, I still don't tend to do it. Our next ship, tiny bit of foreshadowing, may be a little bit blocky, but even still, I kind of expect that there's going to be a certain amount of time spent giving things a bit of a refined edge. So you can see how this is coming together. It's kind of like, it's got sort of a pontoon sort of feel to it. I think if I had to describe it in one word, that would probably be one of the better words that I could use to accurately describe it. But I think it fits. And I think it's, I mean, when we're up close looking at it, when we're building it in this particular kind of view, they seem quite large. But when we zoom out and you see how large they are relative to the rest of the ship, you can see that they aren't necessarily going to be drawing a lot of attention to themselves. It's the kind of thing where it's a detail that works with the rest of the ship. It's relatively subtle, and it serves that purpose, like I said, of giving us a little something on the underside of the ship, a little bit more bulk, a little bit more volume, a little bit more substance, so that it kind of balances things out a little bit. I almost feel like I could justify doing one more fin, and when I say fin, I mean like the one on the top, sort of extending out 90 degrees perpendicular to the flat wings we did, a little bit farther forward and on the underside of the ship. I could maybe see doing something like that. I don't know if I will or not. The thought just literally popped into my head as an option. Again, thinking in terms of the impression that you get when you look at the ship. Sometimes you look at something and there's just a feeling like it's missing something. You look at a particular area and it feels like there should be something there. I think it's a very intuitive, sort of subjective kind of thing. Something that I look at and say it needs something, and so I put something there. Someone else might come along and say that makes it look kind of cluttered. It makes it look kind of, you know, overbearing. Might be a word that a person would use. But we've got this whole, you can see on the underside of the ship now, there's a certain distance from where we are to the very front of the ship. I could maybe see adding in that little extra bit of something just to make it fill out a little bit more. But these particular pieces that we're working on now, at this point, I'm just kind of adding various sort of bits and bobs just to kind of fill them out, give them a little bit more detail. I guess they're a little less straightforward now. They just kind of come together a little bit better. So for the time being, I'm declaring those guys on the underside done. And like I say, we may actually come back and do one more on the underside, closer to the front of the ship, just a single thing sticking down. But we'll see. We'll see how that goes. Here is me finally deciding to work out this front section of the ship, and sort of what I realized was that those blocks that I put in place to create a better sort of transition through the curve, while I felt did a really good job of that, were just a little bit too much to line up. So what I did was I went and I filled in with the side blocks to get those lined up with exactly how it was going to fit together, and that left some exposed seams. So then we just removed some of those blocks and refit them in between the new ones that we placed to the sides, and that gets rid of the seams. Everything comes together nicely. It fits together nicely. It's a quick and easy way to fix a particular spot where things aren't lining up. But in this case, it was, I think, probably necessary. I can't imagine any other way that I could have put things together so that they would have lined up properly. It's just, we don't have as good as the resolution is in terms of the size of the blocks that we can create in order to fill in all of these different sort of details. We just didn't have the resolution to make it work in that limited sort of space. So now comes the task of filling in this sort of central piece. And I've left it basically open because I realized that I would probably stuff some things in there and kind of get a feel for what we might be able to tuck in there to get more utility out of the space. So now it's just a matter of sort of getting everything lined up with the outer edges so that we know where the limits are in terms of what we have for space to start tucking things in, and getting all of the last sort of details taken care of and smoothed off before we start putting things together. The difficulty with a shape like this is that you can't really fill it in with large blocks because there are so many small little steps, and this particular area here is an excellent example of that. There's only so much that you can fit in here in the large sense, but if we're a little bit cautious and a little bit thoughtful about what we're doing and how we're doing it, there's quite a bit of room that we have that we can make use of in order to get everything to sort of pay its own way, I guess you can say. We've got those pieces off to the sides that are currently nothing other than looks. They're not big enough or thick enough to be defensive structures. They don't have anything on them that makes them actually purposeful or functional, but they're there, and that to me was not that big of a deal. But I can only feel right about doing so much of that on one ship before I feel like I've got all of this extra stuff that's just taking up space, but is not actually contributing to anything other than the looks. So we've got a little bit of touch up here, just kind of finishing off that profile of this top section. Very straightforward. There's nothing particularly complicated about what we're doing here. We're just smoothing it off with slope blocks, and then that sort of defines where we have space to start jamming equipment once we get a handle on how we're going to close it off, which you can see it takes me a little while, a little bit of mucking about to try and get a handle on how we're going to fit all of this stuff. Now, in terms of what I wanted to place in this part of the ship, it wound up being kind of weird. All of the things that I thought of to place in here, either I was concerned that they weren't well enough defended, things like generators, or the kind of stuff that is the last thing that you want to see destroyed. I didn't want to put it in this particular part of the ship because this is probably one of the first parts of the ship that's going to start to take damage. The armor is not very thick. It's not a very large, robust piece. And it was just one of those things where I decided that if I was going to put anything in here at all, it had to be something that I was willing to lose on a fairly regular basis as we found ourselves in combat situations and we started taking damage. I understand, I think, at least enough about how the integrity field generators work that, I mean, obviously they make sense. They're probably one of the better additions that we could make, but you can see when we put them in, and we just put in a fairly large block, it doesn't actually apply to anything other than this little narrow strip down the middle of the ship. And I think that has to do with the orientation of those blocks. I did try, you can see here, just very briefly, you may have seen the flicker, rotating the block to kind of get a feel for maybe how we might deal with that. But I think what it is a certain amount of space that's protected based on the orientation of the block and its location on the ship. You get sort of a layer, so to speak, and what we've got here is that layer that's running down the middle of the ship with very little coverage off to the sides. But taken as an aggregate, I think it'll probably be worth it overall. I started placing gyro blocks in here. You can see that they don't have the glowing bits that the integrity field generators do, and then I removed them because as I was sort of looking at the impact that they were having on the ship's performance numbers, they were basically non-contributors. And I understand that that may change if we got some crew on board, that it might improve those numbers. It may change if we put a generator at some point on the ship, but it didn't make sense to me that we see it, you know, a certain impact that's coming from the integrity fields without any generators. Why not gyros? We saw an impact on the performance of the ship from the directional thrusters without any generators. Why not the gyros? So I just took them out for now. I'm not saying we won't have gyros on the ship. I just didn't decide to keep them here. You can see we're back to placing integrity field generators. And one of the things that I was sort of looking at as I was placing them is that we're putting all the little pieces in trying to make everything conform so that we can get as much into the space as possible, but there was also an opportunity to group some of those smaller pieces together so that we would get more for the volume calculation and all of those shenanigans. So that'll be it for this episode. If you want to be notified of new videos in this and other series, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel and or follow me on social media. Links for social media always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.